I've made myself a little trammel set like this, and it's made out of steamed pear and bog oak, and it's really rather nice. I used to have a nice brass set, actually, that was my granddad's, but somebody stole it. But the fact that it's taken me 10 years to make a replacement gives you an idea of just how little use it got. There are 2 trammel points in this set. The point is just a darning needle, a bodkin, and they fit onto a trammel bar as long as I like, and I've sized it so that it can use an off-rip of a 1-inch board. So there's a 20mm gap, 3/4 of an inch in there, because there's always that kind of a stick kicking around in the workshop. And I can either have 2 different points and step out, or I can put a pencil head on there and use it to mark out circular arcs like that. I don't really want these just to be kicking around in the drawer or in a cupboard, so I've made myself a nice little box to keep them in, and it's this one here. It's made out of walnut, and this rather lovely walnut was given to me as firewood. Chest of drawers, very poorly made, and the carcass is just firewood. But the drawer fronts are walnut, and I've used one of them to make this box. There is no metal hardware in this box. Everything is wooden, including the hinges. When you look at how a hinge is made, the geometry is exactly the same as a box joint. And as I've recently made a rather excellent box joint jig, I decided to use it to make myself a box. So I've got the corners made as a box joint, and if you look carefully, you'll see they're all exactly the same size, despite the fact that I've taken a piece out to sever them, and that's because I made that middle pin wider than it should be, fatter, so that by exactly the same amount as the curve of the blade, so that when I cut the lid off, they go back together and look as if there's no gap at all. I was quite pleased with that. Can you tell? And the hinges are also made on the same jig because the geometry is exactly the same. So all this takes place over on the table saw. So just turn round a bit and meet me over there. Oh, and by the way, welcome to Workshop Essentials. I'm using my box joint jig for 2 operations in this box project. If you've not seen the jig, there's a YouTube video of it, just click up there. But for the box itself, I used my 8mm slider. So that goes in there and it moves left and right like that to end up with an 8mm finger and socket. And I started off with a workpiece, instead of being 40mm, which is what I wanted to finish at, 5 fingers at 8mm, I started off with workpiece that was 43mm wide, and I worked in from both ends, both sides. And that meant that my central finger was nice and fat, too fat by 3mm. So that after I'd cut for the hinge recesses and separated the lid from the box, then I ended up with a finger that was exactly the same size as all the others. So when it's put together, you can't tell that there's been a saw cut there. I was quite pleased with that. That was with the 8mm slider. But for the hinges, I want a 5mm slider because I want to end up with a hinge which is 1 inch wide with 5 knuckles in it. So, very little movement there. We've only got to produce 5mm and the blade itself is 3.2, so very little movement. For a box joint, I would want the fingers to be really quite snug, but for a hinge, I want there to be easy movement. So for a box joint, I would want a fit where the 2 pieces would stay together, but for a finger joint, I want loose like that. I don't want them to be able to stay together. And I've done that. I've achieved that by moving that screw in just a little tiny bit more than it would do for a box joint fit, so that there's a little bit more movement and these sockets end up just a little bit bigger than they would be otherwise. So I get a nice easy fit so that I'm not going to end up with a hinge which is difficult to operate. And I've got one here somewhere. So this is what we're looking for, that kind of fit. Okay, and when we've got that, and I've got my two pieces that match, then it's over to the drill press to drill for the hinge pin.
The hinge pin itself is a bamboo skewer. It's accurately sized at 3mm and it's very strong indeed. I thought I had a 5/16 of an inch roundover cutter, but I can't find it. So I'm using part of an OG cutter that has the same radius.
So these are the loose knuckles, but with a 3mm bamboo pin in a 3mm hole. And although the knuckles themselves are loose, the hinge is still pretty stiff actually. If that's what you want, great. If not, we'll take the dowel out and drill the one with 2 fingers. And I'm going to enlarge that hole from 3mm to 3.2mm, which is 1/8 of an inch. It's really handy living in a country where we use both metric and imperial, because that 0.2mm is going to give me just the clearance I need. And that is now very loose indeed, and it will stay put, but if there was any load on it, I don't think it would. And if I wanted it any looser than this, I could simply run it out at 3.5mm and give myself even more clearance there. So by being canny about the way that I use my finger joint jig, box joint jig, and the size that I make these holes, I can decide how loose a fit I want for my hinge. When the hinges are glued in, they look like this. It's still a bit chunky and not terribly attractive just yet, but they operate beautifully. The box opens, the lid stays where it's put, and it closes without binding because I put a little piece of paper in there when I glued the hinges in. So that's rather nice, I think. So now I need to clean these up, and we're going to mitigate the chunkiness of it over on the router table.
I'm using a cove cutter to remove this, and the idea is to get it as delicate as possible without making it too fragile. As you'll see, I'm not at all certain that I succeeded.
Well, I've cleaned it up and it's good. It's not excellent. I've in my endeavour to get it as delicate as possible, I've actually gone a bit too close to the knuckle and I've lost a few fibres. I've not ruined it, but it is imperfect. I'm glad this isn't for a client. This is just a workshop box. So that's a lesson for next time. And I know what I've done wrong. When I was doing it on the router table, I didn't have a backer for the spelching, for the breakout of this, and both of them have lost a little bit at that point. So never mind, it's a workshop box, it's not a jewellery box for the love of my life. So that's working very nicely now. Now the top and bottom are taken from the same board. Actually, this was a drawer front, and it wasn't obvious when I recycled it that there was this enormous amount of sapwood. So I've not got enough heartwood to do it without. So I shall do exactly what they did in the olden days. Include the sapwood and stain it. It's a traditional fix.
After gluing the top and bottom in place, however, I decided that I quite liked what the sapwood looked like. So I've decided to keep it as it is. I've installed both leaves of this hinge vertically. It makes it very easy to ensure that the box and lid stay aligned, but the downside is that the lid is restricted to a 90-degree opening. If I'd installed the top leaf horizontally, I could get 180 degrees of opening, but it's much more difficult to ensure that it all lines up nicely. A challenge for next time, I think.
So that's my no metal, all wood box hinge. If you've enjoyed watching this film, please remember to like and subscribe and share. It does matter. And thank you very much for watching. Until the next time, enjoy your workshop. Cheerio.